I am Uhtred, son of Uhtred, born a Saxon and raised a Dane. Welcome back to my channel, guys. Today we are reviewing the final season, that's season 5 of The Last Kingdom. Although that being said, like Peaky Blinders, The Last Kingdom does have a confirmed film feature length coming on Netflix called Seven Kings Must Die, as a sort of epilogue to wrap up the entire narrative. But season 5 of The Last Kingdom was impressive. I think season 5, following season 3, is my second favourite season of the whole show. I think it ties together its characters and its storylines perfectly. Some in more satisfying ways than others, and obviously some characters are always going to stand out more than others, particularly because The Last Kingdom has always been such an ensemble show with lots of really interesting and entertaining characters. My biggest fear with season 5 was how they were going to integrate the Bevenburg storyline, because Bevenburg has always been the end game for this show, but narratively it's always been either sidelined or there's been something more important to deal with first. Or in season 4, it ended in tragedy, so they put off going back there for ages. So we've only been drip-fed elements of Bevenburg in the storyline up until this point. So I was really worried that Uhtred's kind of restoration of Bevenburg and his family homeland was going to feel tacked on at the end of a broader story. And to an extent it does feel like that, but I think the writers do a really good job of anchoring Bevenburg at the centre of the whole Last Kingdom story. And it gives us the final 3 episodes to really invest in that storyline. Witgar was a really interesting character, and I think he is underused. I mean, in season 4 he was brought in, he kills Elfrich, he kills Beocca, denies Uhtred his kind of birthright. And so I thought he was going to be a bit more of a force to be reckoned with. Whereas season 5 portrays him as a bit more of a pantomime kind of villain, quite a sleazy, sly character, whereas I think he had a bit more resolve in season 4. But ultimately Witgar was only one of a number of antagonists, with Athelhelm taking centre stage as a character who almost borders on the Shakespearean in terms of corrupting the kingdoms and trying to turn one against the other and instigating a war. But Uhtred's reclamation of Bevenburg felt triumphant. It did feel like a much deserved win. And I think you'll notice looking back that they killed off most of the characters that they were going to kill off to kind of free up that final stretch to be more of an uplifting, well-earned win, rather than suffering tragic losses in the finale. We lost Ethelfled in episode 4, we lost Osverth and the Queen in episode 5, we lost Sigtrygr in episode 6. And it did feel like they were decluttering the cast to make room for the final stretch of episodes to be all about Uhtred going forward and planting the narrative firmly where it's been set up to be from the very start. I also much preferred Edward in season 5. I think in season 4 he was written in a way that was too much of a contrast to how he was in season 3. Susceptible to influence for sure, but not completely against common sense, whereas season 4 sort of shut him off completely as Athelhelm's lapdog and really didn't make him likeable. I'm still not over how he just stood there while Steapa had his head caved in, but we've moved on from that. Whereas season 5 made him a problematic leader, a leader who was always going to have his own agenda, but was more compromising with his lords and the people around him. And that made for a much more interesting political dynamic between characters like him and Uhtred. And I really did love that conversation at the end of episode 10 between Uhtred and King Edward, where Uhtred's denying Northumbria to King Edward. And it sort of leaves a sour taste in the mouth after this triumphant victory, and is obviously going to factor quite heavily into the Seven Kings Must Die movie. But I think that whole approach to those characters was a lot more mature this season, and it really did them justice. I really liked Edward despite his unlikable decisions in certain instances. You understood them a lot more. Sigtrygr was my favourite character coming out of season 4, and I think it was such a refreshing take on the Danes to have a younger, not as well built figure who thought with their head more than with their desire to kind of swing swords and kill people. He was a man of intellect, a man of humility, and he just went against the archetypal role that we've had these Danes play in the show up until this point. I think his arc in season 5 was really engaging. I loved how it put him on the back foot a lot. I do think his relationship with his brother Rognvalda was probably one of the least interesting side plots that were introduced in this season. I don't think it amounted to much. Although since Rognvalda kind of dropped out of the show around the midpoint, it will be interesting to see the role he's going to play going forward in the film, because ultimately in this season I felt like Sigtryggr didn't have the room to flex his more intellectual side. He was presented always as more reactive than preemptive in terms of predicting what was going to happen, and that whole battle scene was probably my favourite battle in season 5. As much as I love the battle for Bevenburg, it felt too colourful, whereas the battle at the lake encampment felt more gritty. Because it was at the middle of the season, you felt like anyone could die, and there was just a real atmosphere of impending doom, whereas the battle for Bevenburg, ultimately you know it's going to end in victory sort of thing. We had the returns of fan favourites like Hild, which I was really pleased to see. We said goodbye to fan favourite characters like Heston, and I'm still slightly unsure on the complete 180 of his character choice in episode 9 leading up to his death, because it didn't feel like they'd necessarily earned it, and it would have been nice to have had him feature in a couple more episodes in the final series to sort of demonstrate a bit more character growth, to then earn that moment where he decides to protect Uhtred and Hild. But I've always loved Heston, and it was a shame to see him go. Constantine was a great addition to the cast. I loved how he was more of a complex king rather than a king they just introduced as an antagonist. It was really great to see the respect he showed to Athelflaed's daughter, and the maturity and political skill he demonstrated when speaking with Athelhelm and Withgar and the Lords of the North. Plus his little solo fight scene when he leaves the gates of Bevenburg and just batters everyone with shield and sword was really great. It felt like they did a lot with that character in a short space of time. Harry Gilby, who plays Athelstan, I loved. Just a quick shout out to him. I think he was also a real favourite of mine as a new character. As a young actor, I think he really held his own. And over the last couple of seasons, Eliza Buttworth as Queen Alswith has become a favourite as well. I've really loved her kind of sarcastic sass with underlying compassion that she's really brought to the show since Alfred's death, and kind of having to characterise herself in a world without her husband. And her scene with Uhtred in the chapel after Athelflaed's death is a really heartwarming moment in a really bleak season. Ivor and John Lund's score, I think, is my favourite it's been in the whole show. I think the Last Kingdom soundtrack is probably one of my favourite soundtracks of all time. I just love Eivor's vocals in selling the more emotional moments and kind of the slight variations on more familiar themes that we know. Like, there's a really beautiful track when Uhtred and Athelflaed have their final scene together, and the final track accompanying that last montage with Uhtred overlooking Bevenburg really encompasses that sense of heartache and tragedy but ultimate victory that has kind of haunted the entire show. It was just a beautiful piece of music that really did this show justice. The very few criticisms that I do have tend to be around the side characters. You know, I love Finan and Sihtric and Osferth, and you don't always need characters to have character development, because I think they're just the comfort characters that we find reassurance and take a moment of relief whenever they're on screen together. But I just think it would have been nice for them to have had a bit more of an arc, I think, in the final season, because they've never felt really fleshed out beyond when Uhtred first meets them in season 2. They've always just been kind of there as his sidekicks for seasons 3, 4 and 5. And also the Finn and Edith romance that was semi-hinted at the end of season 4 is completely dropped, and Edith suddenly has more flirty moments with Uhtred. I'm not sure whether the writers forgot what they were setting up in season 4. It felt as though they were suddenly retracting on their creative decisions and going in a different direction. It just kind of stood out a bit. But yes, overall, absolutely adored The Last Kingdom. I'm so glad it kind of reached #1 globally on Netflix, because it is such an underrated show. Season 5 goes out on a real high and cements the show's legacy as a great one, with all the actors knocking it out of the park, the storyline converging into a cohesive finish, with only some more supporting characters feeling slightly underwritten or fulfilling more plot device roles. But overall, couldn't be happier. Thank you to the cast and crew for such a fantastic journey. Destiny is all.
To Bevenburg then, Lord Uhtred?
To Bevenburg!